A phone, first of all, is sort of an emblematic figure of our age. I think when the archaeologists dig us all up, right, they're going to say, oh, this is, they'll find us with the phones in our hands, right? And they'll say this was a talismanic device for these primitive peoples who clung to these with such dedication.
The library was my space, and there was just so much.
To the Harbor Grace excursion with the voice to have a time.
How we're going to start is Vincent is going to give a little introduction to the book for those of you who may not have read it, and then a little reading, and then we will continue with our conversation. I'd like to let you know, too, that we'll have time for a Q&A at the end of the talk, so save up your questions, and questions, not comments, and that would be great. We'll be happy to answer them. Vincent.
Great to be here with you, Deborah. So this novel, On the Ravine, is a novel in which you will meet Claire. And Claire is a young violinist who wants nothing more than to create beautiful music and bring it into the world. And she is also someone who has had a painful injury. And via this injury, opiates come into her life and impact her life in a deep way. Another person whom you will meet or perhaps re-encounter is Dr. Chen. And Dr. Chen is a physician who is trying to help folks whose lives have been impacted by opiate use disorder. And he meets Claire. And so this is really a novel which has to do with what happens when the two of them meet. There's a few other characters, but that's kind of the central duo, if you will. And I'm just going to read to you briefly from the novel, and I'll read to you from an early chapter, not the very beginning, but an early chapter to introduce you to Claire. And you'll meet her at the same time that the reader meets her. Pounding, and the rattle of the locked door latch. Claire, are you okay? Are you in there? Aching neck. The sea green tiles a blur, and then they resolved into squares as grout lines wobbled into focus. Her nose and the side of her face were pressed into the grab bar. She must have slipped off the toilet and now found herself half wedged between the bowl and the wall, her arms folded in front of her like a closed book or a prayer. She tried to get up, and at first her legs would not push her up out of their tangle. She sank forward onto her knees, thinking, I missed the best part. From outside, the voices of children from the beginner violin class she was supposed to be teaching. Where is Miss Claire? Is she all right? Another declared with excitement, I saw her go in there, Miss Francis. It looked like she was going to barf. Had she told her class that she was going to the bathroom, or did she just slip away while they were doing an exercise? The horsehair screeching over strings had grated more than usual, pulled her skin up through itself. It wasn't only the sound, and it would just take a minute to fix herself. She had been trying to teach the fluid bow arm how to glide across the bridge rather than grinding down into the strings. But the morning shot hadn't lasted like it should, and her own sore arm had been shaky. Then an unexpected burst of the sweats. Now she recalled stopping, turning to the children. Show me, your turn. Then a blank. And now she was in the bathroom. Is this one already fading? She thought with sorrow, as she had hoped that the warmth would float her back to class, turn the noise into melodies.
Thank you. This is a book, obviously, that deeply centers the opioid crisis. When did you decide that you wanted to tackle the opioid crisis fictionally?
Well, it was about 8 years ago that I started to write this book. And really the core of the book, when I started writing about it, or writing it, was to do with medical research. And there was an encompassing or a folding into the space of the issue with opioids, which we now call the opioid crisis. And really, as the book grew, it grew in that direction, and it grew to be what it is.
So 8 years. It took you. It took you 8 years to write it. Did you know what you were going to write when you first started writing?
No. Well, I thought I did. And, I think anyone from my publisher should now plug their ears, because really that outline which I gave you many years ago, I really thought that's what the book was going to be, honestly. It just turned out to be quite different. These things happen.
They do. Tell us a little bit about the process. What did you think it was going to be, and how did it unfold?
What did I think it was going to be? I thought that, and it's not a book which is not about science. It's very much about science, as well as about the opioid crisis. But the science and the discovery part was in many ways more forefront of mind when I began to write it. And that in and of itself is a passionate process that people engage in. We think, oh, science, so dry, so sterile, but it's not at all. It's incredibly passionate as a process of discovery and risk-taking and exploration. And that was really where I thought it was going to be rooted. And that ends up being in the book, but that ends up occupying, I think, a space of greater vulnerability and a space of greater unknown. And maybe that's how my thinking evolved as I wrote the book. But it's not that what I thought was going to be there isn't there. It's just that there are other dimensions as well.
It became so much more through the writing and in the writing.
Yes, exactly. Yeah.
So you returned to two characters, as you mentioned, that were in bloodletting and miraculous cures, Dr. Chen and Fitzgerald. Why did you decide that you wanted to revive them at this point in time? It's 17 years later.
Oh gosh, that does sound like so much time. It's actually quite shocking. They were not there at the very start. I think Chen came into the book relatively early, and Fitzgerald came into the book relatively late. When you work on something for 8 years, it all becomes quite approximate in terms of the timelines. But I would say that Fitzgerald appeared, roughly speaking, in the last quarter of the time that I spent working on the book. And my process is really hard to characterize as a process, because it's really meandering, it's disorganized. There's a lot of inefficiency, there's a lot of exploration, a lot of pages written that are discarded, and out of those come sort of a gelling, a condensation, a solidification of characters. And so I can remember the characters whom Fitzgerald used to be, and they were not Fitzgerald, and they were not doctors.
Okay.
But there were other people to whom things happened and who did things, and they became Fitzgerald.
So when you're writing, you've got this character that does this and this character that does that, and then you think, maybe they should be in one character. It'll make it a little leaner and cleaner. Is that? Yes,
absolutely. I mean, the efficiency aspect in the sense of trying to be very close to the emotions of the story and stick really close to them. Those sometimes end up revealing themselves to be in one character rather than two, in terms of how I work. And You know, it's a funny thing. I start with this whole kind of foggy landscape, really not knowing what's happening, being very lost in some ways myself in the book. But by, I would say, the latter quarter, so again, that latter quarter, by the latter quarter, I really know what's happening, and I really feel that it's the book revealing it to me. By the end, the book just tells me, well, this is what's supposed to happen here and here, and I feel really comfortable and just like it's being given to me. And I know that it's the first 3 quarters that has given it to me, but that's how I feel. And so that's where characters come together and plot comes together and even narrative structure comes together. Yeah.
That must be a heck of a moment after all that slogging.
Yeah, you know, I really wish the proportions could be reversed. It's a terrible way to work, you know, to spend 75% of the time kind of lost, and 25% of the time. No, I shouldn't say that. It's not terrible.
Yeah.
It's disconcerting for a long time, but then it's a great gift. Yeah.
Now, the book starts with Chen looking through his phone. He wakes up in the middle of the night and reaches for his phone, like so many of us do. And what he does is he goes through an image gallery, photos of patients. Can you tell us about that gallery? Because it appears and you know, throughout the book at various times. Why include that? What did it mean to you? How did it function as a device for you?
Well, I think a phone, first of all, is sort of an emblematic figure of our age. I think when the archaeologists dig us all up, right, they're going to say, oh, this is, phones. You know, they'll find us with the phones in our hands, right, and they'll say this was a talismanic device for these primitive peoples who clung to these with such dedication. So it's impossible to write a book now without phones. When I wrote Bloodletting, I can't remember. Oh no, I did have a phone, and as my children claim they don't comprehend, it was a phone that was just numbers, right? So a lot of time has passed, and I think it's hard to write a book set in the modern era without including some understanding of the way that devices infiltrate that era. And of course, phones are the preeminent device of this age. And phones then do provide this kind of surrogate mind for most of us. So it's this surrogate repository of the things which mean the most to us, which trouble us, which haunt us. And it's also as if we're being constantly followed by all the spirits of all the people who could be in our lives, because they can always get in touch with us.
This is true.
Yes.
This is true.
Yes. Unless you're on stage at an event, in which case
the phone's back there,
exactly.
and it's just us. It's a great thing.
Yeah, it's just you and I, you know, and 100 close friends
Exactly.
or so.
Exactly.
So that's, I think, where the device of the phone comes. And in terms of the meaning of the images for the character Chen carries the lives of his patients with him. And Chen carries both the lives of his patients who are in this world and those who have left the world. And that's important to him for a variety of reasons. It's important to him because he has chosen to care deeply about his patients, and therefore he can't simply let them go even if they have left the world. And it matters deeply to him as well because he devotes the best of himself to caring for people. And this doesn't always mean that things work out the way that he hopes they will. And so when he thinks of the patients who are no longer in the world, he's also questioning himself, and he's asking himself what the best of himself served, whether he could have done something differently, whether he could have done less or more. And sometimes it's right there where where he's very caught. He doesn't know if he should have done less or more, which would have been better. And so these are some of the things that he thinks about as he reviews the images of his departed patients in his phone.
As a doctor, and yourself, how do you keep yourself from caring too much?
You know, that's a great question, and it's a constant balancing point, and I don't claim to know that I'm already or I'm always at the right balancing point. So I'm very aware that it's right on that edge where if you don't care enough as a doctor, then you're not being the best doctor whom you could be. And likewise, if you invest too many of your own hopes, too many of your own presumptions, imaginations into what you wish for your patients, then maybe you're also not being the best possible doctor. And so I'm aware of that sort of very narrow balancing point, and I don't always know that I'm at the right place on it.
It's tricky because you need to let your patients be themselves too.
Yes, absolutely. You know, your patients are themselves, right? Your patients are well, you know, they are always versions of themselves at a particular point. The thing about addiction is that often at a particular point, people are not the version of themselves whom they hope to be. And they're probably not the best version of themselves. They may be in a place where it's really hard for them to imagine the best version of themselves. And so I do think, in a very deep way, that part of the work of being with someone who is in a place where they can't imagine the best version of themselves, whether that's because of a substance use disorder or a mental health disorder, or what we categorize differently as a physical problem, and yet that line is incredibly blurry. You know, that line is not at all a clear or a distinct one. I think part of the work, whether one is a physician or a nurse or a caregiver or a friend or a family member in the life of someone in that situation, is to imagine what else is possible.
Yeah.
And yet, it is their life, and we have to respect that.
It's Claire as a character and seems to, you know, embody all of that. We see the best of her and we see the worst of her. She becomes an emblematic character in many ways, and a character that we care deeply about. How do you approach constructing your characters? That's the question. How do you approach constructing your characters?
Yes, well, I've come to realize that that there's a particular framework that I use as Vincent Lam, the writer, who's writing a work of fiction, and like so many things, I only really understand this in retrospect.
Yeah.
And I felt my way towards it and didn't really understand it while doing it. But what I've realized is that as a starting point, it's incredibly important for me that the particulars of my characters, so their details, their preoccupations, you know, the things which would make them identifiable on the street or to a neighbor, must be entirely fictional. So one of the reasons Claire is a violinist is because although I have many wonderfully talented patients who are artists and performers and in many other professions, I don't have any violinists.
Okay.
And so it's really important for me that the characters are completely fictional in terms of all that identifiable stuff. And that's important on the medical side of things because it's incredibly important that I not violate people's confidentiality. And then it's incredibly important as a fiction writer because I need the freedom that provides. I can't be thinking of a real person when I'm trying to bring to life a fictional person. So there's that piece. And then once that framework is there, then for me it's about entirely inhabiting that character and imagining their life as it unfolds, and by imagining it, having a sense of what to depict as being important to them, and rendering that on the page.
There's a wonderful point where we realize that Chen and Claire are sort of intersect, which is Chen's at a restaurant bar and she's playing, and we meet the two of them, and he's seeing her as this wonderfully talented violinist, and she's up there doing her thing. But it's a drop for her because she had this great career before her, and now here she is playing a restaurant bar, and there's something poignant about seeing the possibilities in the two of them.
Yes, absolutely, and I think that's one of the things which speaks to the book being a very urban book. Mm-hmm. They're encountering at many levels. They encounter in the clinic, and then they encounter in a restaurant, and these things happen in many ways by chance. Mm-hmm. And to me, that's one of the magical things about cities, because there's so many people and so many spheres of interactions that we're sort of spinning around and encountering people by chance, and we never know exactly what's going to happen, but it could be really interesting, whatever it is.
There is, throughout the book, so there's this wonderful narrative that carries us through, and throughout the book there are these letters to a former unnamed student that Chen writes. What were you trying to do with them that you couldn't do with the rest of the narrative?
Yeah, well, the student came very, very late. So if Fitz came in the last quarter, the student came, now that we're using fractions, we'll just say in the last eighth.
Okay, so very late.
So very late, very late. And the genesis of it, from an editorial perspective, was that there were, I guess the boring name is what were called interstitial passages. Mm-hmm. So there were passages in which Dr. Chen is talking about some of the things that he likes to talk about, otherwise known as rambling. And so there were editorial questions about that. And the nature of those editorial questions were something like, why is he rambling so much? Actually, my editor is far more articulate than that. But it was out of a series of conversations trying to place these interstitial passages, trying to situate them, trying to figure out who they were written to, that I realized that Chen was trying to teach.
Okay.
And so who does one teach to? One teaches to a student.
And so it was clear. Now, Claire, we talk about addiction in so many different ways as to who is addicted and how they're addicted. And Claire was initially prescribed opioids for a shoulder injury. So for the right reasons, right? She didn't go out and start doing illicit drugs. They were prescribed, and then she became addicted. And there's this idea that there are right and wrong reasons to become, that people become addicted, and how that reflects in the way they're treated by society, by the medical profession. Can you talk about that a little bit?
Sure, that's a great observation. And there absolutely are these notions that we have of the, quote, right and, mm-hmm. quote, wrong reasons for which people are prescribed substances. And those really arise out of our values as a society. Those really arise out of sometimes what we can identify with and what we have more difficulty identifying with. And I don't think that those concepts are always helpful. And what really struck me when I began to work in the field of substance use disorders was that if we just put all of that aside, this notion of the right and the wrong reasons, it seems to me that there are really basic, common, fundamental reasons for which people choose to use substances. And this is not a comprehensive list, but some of the reasons are that people wish to avoid anxiety, people wish to avoid pain, people wish to be more comfortable in a certain situation, people wish to have an enjoyable experience. And if that sounds a lot like you and me,
Yeah.
it's because that's very common to all of us. It is you and me, and I'm going to guess it's most of the people in this audience. One of the things which ends up being really difficult is that I think it's important to hold that concept and to recognize that that concept doesn't actually map very well with this judgmental notion of right and wrong. So it's important to hold that concept and also to hold the concept that there are things which work more functionally in the long term than others. And there are things which work in the short term, but not in the long term. And it just so happens that a lot of substances fall into the category of things which do what you want them to do in the short term, but don't really do what you want them to do in the long term. And from that comes a lot of human suffering.
The landscape of the book is very familiar. I mean, you take us on a bicycle ride through the streets. You take us to the encampments in the Rosedale Ravine. You take us inside communities that we might not otherwise be able to see. Why was that important for you to do?
To me, that's an incredibly important form of travel within our city, within Toronto. And so, again, to me, it's writing to the nature of cities, that we're in these intersecting circles. We pass by thousands of people every day on the streets, and we might interact with them or we might not. We might live in Rosedale and wander down into the ravine, or we might not. And if we do wander into the ravine, we might have a conversation with someone whose life is very different than our own.
Yeah.
Or we might just keep on walking. And so, to me, that's at once the great possibility of cities, and it's one of the deep sadnesses of cities. The possibility is always there for us to understand people whose lives are incredibly different than our own. And yet the sad thing is that sometimes there isn't, excuse me. The possibility is always there to interact with people whose lives are not our own. And yet sometimes the space isn't there, whether that's the space within ourselves or the space within the city.
It's interesting because cities are very anonymous and very intimate at the same time, and you sort of explore that a little bit. Another thing about being, exploring the Rosedale Ravine is there are the encampments, and people are sort of going up the ravine from the back into Fitzgerald's house. And there's a couple of things going on there. I mean, there's a sort of a bit of a class thing. They're going from there to this place where he's rich, and he's approaching things in a certain way. Can you talk about sort of the idea of class distinction that you explore a bit within the book?
Yeah, class is certainly a excuse me.
Is there anything else I can get you, or just
No, I think
just a tickle?
the water is the. I don't think it's COVID. I'll just say for the record, but I'll do a rapid test later, and everyone will get an email.
That's right.
No, I was talking for 3 hours this afternoon, and even for someone who likes to talk,
That's a long time.
it's a long time. So class is present in the book, and class is fluid. And I think that's, again, one of the interesting things about Toronto as a city. I think, I mean, class is to some degree fluid in all cities and all places in the world, but I think probably in Toronto there's more fluidity in terms of class than there might be in other cities. And so the particular class situations of Dr. Chen and Dr. Fitzgerald, well, we look at it and we say, well, they're both doctors, right? So they're both kind of upper class people.
Mm-hmm. You're okay?
I'm okay.
We'll wait.
Hold on one second. But one of the important differences in vantage point is that Chen is coming into a class. And so Chen's family is an immigrant family of color.
Mm-hmm.
And so they're coming into a certain strata of society. And implicit in Chen's understanding of the world is that the way that you inhabit that strata of society is that you follow the rules.
Yeah.
Now, it might be that you are clever, and because you are clever, you try to express yourself, and you try to individualize the function of these rules to your own interests and passions, but nonetheless, the presumption is always that the way you inhabit this strata of society is that you follow the rules.
Yep.
Fitzgerald comes from a different vantage point. Fitzgerald starts from being very wealthy. And for him, it may be that the way he expresses his individuality is by breaking the rules.
Mm-hmm.
When you're born into everything, then you don't have to be like all the rest of these boring people who were born into everything. Let's do whatever we want. And so both of them are trying to find a place of their own within the same profession, within, in a way, the same class. And yet because they come to it from very different class experiences, the choices they make, and there are other reasons that they make these choices as well, but class is one of the reasons why they make very different choices.
It also, they also make different choices in the way that addiction is treated. And it gets at the sort of a bit of the philosophy, the competing philosophies that systemically we look at treating addictions ourselves, whether it's Fitzgerald saying, okay, people are going to be addicted, let's provide a safe place and indulge the addiction, where Chen tries to get to the root cause. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yes, sure. So both of them are coming from different directions at some kind of balance point. Mm-hmm. And that balance point, which is exactly what you described, which is trying to understand where the right place is to sit between, quote, doing what people want and giving people, again, quote, what they want. Mm-hmm. And trying to support, cultivate, nurture a different way of being, that balancing point is at the heart of addiction medicine. Yeah. And now, the thing about novels is you have to give the characters a vantage point. Mm-hmm. You can't just have them be incredibly diplomatic and trying to strike compromises between everyone they meet. That would be so boring.
Conflict
Yeah.
is good in novels.
So you need at least two characters,
Yep.
sometimes more.
And there's a lot of conflict and a lot of sort of soul searching that goes on with Chen's relationship with Big Pharma, which I found sort of, delightful in its in the big moral questions that it brought out. Can you talk about how you got to that?
Sure. Well, Big Pharma was always in the book, even when it was much more so a book about science and about research, because, of course, power and money are incredibly influential in this age and in this city, and we all experience that. And so the relationship with big pharma and with business and with money is also about the relationship that Chen has with powers that are bigger than himself. This is potentially a way for him to access a source of power and legitimacy, right? And so there's that, right? And there's also an exercise of intellectualism, which is part of Chen's avenue into this world. And so one of the things about playing by the rules is that if you know the rules very well, then you can hope to use them in a way that makes your point,
Yeah.
right? And in a way that gives you a position, perhaps of influence, but actually I think more important for Chen, even than influence, is just being intellectually vindicated. You know, being the clever one, being the one who's figured it out, right? So he's motivated by that, and part of his avenue to do that is his relationship with research and with pharma.
Part of his motivation, too, seems, I mean, he genuinely and truly wants to help his patients.
Oh, yes. Yeah, certainly. Yeah. And you know, one of the wonderful things about him as a character is that he's got all of that going on. You know, it's no wonder that the guy has difficulty sleeping, right? Because all of that is there. You know, he does have his own sense of ambition intellectually and within the culture in which he lives. And yes, you're absolutely right. What motivates him perhaps even more viscerally is this desire to help his patients and to bring that former force forward for the benefit of his patients. And so these things sound great, right? They all sound really lovely. You know, don't we all want to meet this guy, right? He's a scientist, he cares deeply about his patients. It all sounds wonderful. But it's actually really complicated, and these coexisting motivations cause a great deal of conflict in his life.
It's also illustrative of the medical community, though. I mean, you have to rely on big pharma for the money to do the research, to help your patients, and, you know, sometimes, as Chen shows, it's a question of leading patients to the wrong thing. Not every patient is going to get the drug they need. They're going to get placebos. I mean, how do you reconcile that? It's very tricky.
Yes, you're absolutely right. You know, the forces that we've been talking about absolutely exist in the real world, vis-a-vis the relationship between pharma and corporate interests and the academy, so meaning institutions like universities and hospitals, and individual clinicians. And so these are absolutely true and powerful forces. And I think where we do a disservice is when we fail to acknowledge these forces, when we simply sort of, you know, pretend that we're all on our own versions of the white horse or sitting in our ivory towers, and it's never so simple. So I think what's really important actually is to acknowledge these forces are at work, and if we acknowledge them, then we can also try to counterbalance them in ways that are hopefully helpful for the eventual decisions that get made and the things that actually become part of our medical care system in our society.
Now, you used to be an emergency room doctor.
Yes.
And then you sort of made the transition to working in addiction. What caused you to make that? What made you decide to switch specialties, or how did that work?
Yeah, there were a few things that led me in that direction. I think the really fundamental thing was that I felt like I was constantly a participant in just a little snippet of the story. So I was an emergency physician for 13 years, and I loved that area of practice. and I still miss it a great deal.
It's adrenaline, isn't it, when you're...
You know, there is adrenaline, right? And there's also fatigue, right? And of course, there's the physical fatigue, which comes from working long hours and shift work and that sort of thing. But for me, at least, there was a certain emotional fatigue at a certain point from knowing that every curtain that I opened would be my first impression, my chance to make a first impression yet again. Right, the previous 10 encounters would not matter and should not matter to this patient, but there was a fatigue from constantly having to be on the first page of that particular chapter in that person's book, and also feeling that afterwards there was a sense of dislocation, a sense of being truncated by not knowing what happened in people's stories later. And so, you know, I would go home and wonder about my patients as I do now, but now I have the opportunity often to find out what happened, and as an emergency physician, I often did not. And so I was really looking for something that gave a greater sense of what we in medicine call continuity of care, and I think in the book business, which we call narrative structure.
That's right. It's interesting how close those two are now.